This video is about this book, The Superhumanities, by Professor of Religion and Philosophy Jeffrey J. Kripal. The Superhumanities is about the fact that as humans we've always had superhuman or supernatural capabilities, but perhaps out of fear of who we really are, we've fenced off that part of ourselves into stories that we then regard as pure fiction.
We've shoved things into entertainment, into science fiction, into superhero comics so we can somehow, I suppose, deal with it or entertain ourselves. But those myths and that pop culture has a very serious foundation.
According to Jeffrey Kripal, it is time for the humanities to become the superhumanities. It is time for science to start acknowledging the fact that paranormal, psi, or mystical type experiences that people have might be real. Not only subjectively real as an experience that people have, but that is in the end an illusion of the human mind, but as something that is objectively real, that is a claim on reality.
I wrote this book on the human potential movement in the US, based in California in the 60s and 70s, and I talked to all these people and they were telling me crazy stories. I mean, just things I knew there was no way that could happen. I mean, people were talking about what we now call UFO contacts. They were talking about alien abductions. They were talking about dreams of future events that played out in perfect detail. I mean, just a whole gamut of stuff. And I realized that these people were telling me the truth. And I also realized that we, as scholars of religion, had no way of really understanding what was going on. All we could do is write it off. I think the humanities today really want to talk about everything in terms of society. And I think it's fair and truthful to about 99% of our experience. But that other part of the human condition, that 1% or that percentage of a percentage, actually ends up meaning pretty much everything.
What about that 1% where, say, the magic happens? If the humanities would really want to study that with an open mind, that would imply a metaphysical debate. And here Kripal points to a blind spot in academia.
You don't do metaphysics, you don't do meta-narratives. That's the basic point of the postmodern turn, is that metaphysics are hegemonic and they essentially control people. And so we don't talk about what reality is. We talk about how knowledge is ordered, or how power is constructed, or how words work. The 0 point is this physicalism or this materialism that is never questioned.
According to Kripal, materialism has colonized reality in a sense.
I talk about decolonizing reality, and I'm like, look, you can't pretend you're being diverse and then turn everybody into a good Marxist, because that's your metaphysics. That's European Marxist criticism from the 19th and 20th century. If you're really going to be diverse, you have to take these other ontological claims as claims on reality.
A central figure in Kripal's book is the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. Superman was actually inspired by Nietzsche's notion of the Übermensch, his philosophy about the next phase in human evolution. Now, in mainstream academia, Nietzsche is read as the philosopher who declared God dead, and basically told us that it's up to us humans to come up with our own morals. In analyzing Nietzsche in this way, he's very much put into this 19th century materialist framing. According to Jeffrey Kripal, this is a misreading of Nietzsche.
The people who only talk about the naysayer and the reductionist and the God is dead thing, who exactly are they reading? Because they're not reading the Nietzsche I'm reading. The Nietzsche I'm reading is talking about the uncanny, he's talking about deification, he's talking about ecstasy.
How super was his Übermensch vision? I mean, how close does it get to the real Superman vision?
I don't think he meant it metaphorically. I think he was referring to an actual physical superspecies that existed in the future.
Of course, Kripal distances himself from the fascist misinterpretation of Nietzsche's Übermensch theory. Instead, he's talking about the late crazy Nietzsche, who made metaphysical claims that go way beyond the Stoic self-improvement interpretation of his theory that nowadays is fashionable. Instead, that late true Nietzsche, one could argue, in a sense didn't declare God dead at all, but very much alive, just not in the sense of any organized religion.
Look, the reason God has to die is that so superhumans can live. We have to stop projecting our own divinity and our own immortality outside of ourselves. And this is what Nietzsche was objecting to. He objected to religion not because of its extreme claims. He was saying something much more extreme, much more outrageous, frankly. He objected to religion because it made people weak.
Kripal convincingly shows in his book that many of the foundational thinkers in the humanities, like Nietzsche, Jacques Derrida, Schopenhauer, or William James, had a very open mind when it comes to metaphysics, to ontology, and that they arrived at many of their important ideas not only through scientific reasoning.
Some of the most significant individuals in the history of humanities came to their ideas through altered states. We make the mistake of thinking these people thought their way to these ideas. They did not think their way to these ideas. We have to take seriously these ideas as coming from outside the individual.
I really loved this conversation with Jeffrey Kripal, who wrote, I think, a brilliant and important book that I would have loved reading when I was still in college in the humanities. And I thought it best to start our conversation exactly where Kripal starts his book, namely with Superman and Clark Kent. I hope you enjoy. If we take that Clark Kent Superman metaphor, so basically you are saying that in the humanities we have been focusing only on our Clark Kent, our human capacities, right? Whereas we are also Superman. Is that the way to put it?
Yeah, I mean, I use the Superman Clark Kent mythology to talk to my grad students who basically want to come and do a PhD and be Superman or Superwoman. And essentially what I tell them is you can't do that. Superman actually never gets a job. Nobody ever hires Superman. People only will hire Clark Kent. And so you have to master these skill sets. You have to go to the Daily Planet every day, and you have to pretend that you're just a human being, even though deep down you know you're not, and that our historical materials suggest we're not. We're not just Clark Kent. We're not just human. But the human aspect is really important, and that's the humanities as they sit today. It really focuses there on social criticism and that kind of reductive analysis of human experience, which I think is crucial. And so when I talk about the superhumanities, it's not meant to dismiss or deny the humanities. It's to embrace them, but also talk about what they're not talking about, what we're looking away from, which is the superhuman, which is also a part of our histories and a part of our cultures. And so that's really what I'm trying to get at in this book is a kind of both and, not an either or.
Yeah, that's totally clear throughout the book. But to focus a bit more before we dive into sort of your claim that the humanities have always been the superhumanities, in a sense. If we now focus on the humanities and on that sort of Clark Kent, that human aspect, to just clarify it, we are talking about you are your body, you are your brain. The mind is what the brain does. Is that how you would sort of frame that? Or what are your words to sort of...
Well, I mean, that's much more of a natural science perspective. I mean, certainly in the humanities, everything is reduced down to society. You know, you are your identity. You are your body, or what we call embodiment, is really a function of your place in society and how you are perceived, and language and culture and history and all these things. And so we really do think about the human being as essentially a body and an identity in a social system. And that's perfectly accurate, actually. And I think it's fair and truthful to about 99% of our experience, maybe more. But that other part of the human condition, that 1% or that percentage of a percentage actually ends up meaning pretty much everything to the people who have those experiences. And those are the events that really shape human culture and history and civilization. And so again, that's what I'm trying to say. I think the humanities today really want to talk about everything in terms of society. And the notion that you're the brain or the body, I think is a very natural science kind of attitude. And it fits into this you are your society kind of idea. So they're very much a piece. And the humanities is very much following the natural sciences. It really wants to be a science as well, and it's trying to do the reductive explanatory thing as well.
And it does so from a sort of physicalist or materialist ontology, but what strikes me is that it is not aware of its own ontology, right? Or it doesn't seem to critically reflect on it. Could you just sort of share your thoughts?
Of course, it doesn't have one, Hans. I mean, come on. I mean, that's the 0 point is this physicalism or this materialism that is never questioned. And I shouldn't say never. Of course, it's questioned. It's questioned in philosophy in particular. But I think historians and anthropologists and scholars of religion just often assume that physicalism or materialism is true. And it's not questioned. It's not called into question the way other ontologies or ontological commitments are. My joke is we can make refrigerators, therefore materialism is true. It doesn't follow at all. It's a non sequitur. But I think that's exactly how people think. They confuse the successes and usefulness of technology and science with the truth of materialism.
And you write that sort of we have to catch up, right? That what sort of science now for the last 100 years has been telling us. I mean, and then I think you refer mainly to quantum physics. And that, ironically enough, the humanities have been telling us, right, until a certain period in time, that we now have to do some catching up, right?
Yeah, I think the scientists have to catch up with science too. I mean, I have quantum physicist friends, and the thing a quantum physicist will tell you is there is no such thing as matter. I mean, deep down, it's not matter, and so it's not just that we're working with an old ontology. We're actually assuming a kind of 19th century materialism that was kicked out of the camp of science and physics 100 years ago. But it still, again, reigns because it's just so darn successful and omnipresent that it goes unquestioned.
And to dive a bit into sort of what you mean when you say the super, right? The super, the aspect, sort of the experiences people have or the capacities we have as humans, just to sort of share some sort of, what are we talking about?
Well, so essentially the argument of the book is that some of the most significant individuals in the history of humanities came to their ideas through altered states. And these were extraordinary states. These were precognitive dreams. These were out-of-body experiences. These were near-death experiences. These were psychedelic states. These were mystical experiences induced by any number of things, including psychopathology and probably brain cancer. I mean, there's a whole range of things that induce or catalyze these altered states, but that the ideas come from these altered states. And then they are written out in texts or books, and they kind of enter the mainstream of the humanities. And we make the mistake of thinking these people thought their way to these ideas. They did not think their way to these ideas. That's nonsense, frankly. They were given these revelations, and by the way, they often use the word revelation. And these are not religious people, Hans. They use the word revelation because the idea or the vision was given to them outside their own autonomy, outside their own mind, as it were, and it's forced on them in a just completely convincing way. So that's really what I'm talking about is we have to take seriously these ideas as coming from outside the individual. And this isn't something they reason toward or create a logical syllogism and work their way toward. That's just silly, frankly.
And what is, you named like numerous examples in your book, and that's what I always like about also your previous book, that it's such a thorough research in sort of these fringe people and of course big names as well in the humanities. But if you have to give an example of what you just said, one that spoke most to you in your research and writing your book, what is the first that comes to mind?
Well, probably the first is Schopenhauer, just because he's so central to the history of philosophy. But if you actually read Schopenhauer, it's very clear he had a lot of precognitive dreams and a lot of mystical states. And he took Indian mystical thought extremely seriously because it resonated with his idealism. He saw very clearly that they were getting at some of the same things he was saying. The other person I always turn to is Friedrich Nietzsche. I love talking about Nietzsche because he's received in the academy in his naysaying or his negative modes. You know, he's always received as deconstructing something and, God is dead, which he in fact said, and that's very much a part of Nietzsche. But it's all of this naysaying is towards this yay-saying, and these states of deification and ecstatic states of becoming one with Dionysius or the Christ or the Buddha or whoever that he clearly had as well, particularly towards the end of his life. And those just get written off as, oh, that's just madness, or that's just Nietzsche being nutty or crazy. And I'm like, no, that's Nietzsche. That makes total sense to me, because you can see those same altered states and those same claims of deification in other figures that we call mystical writers. And so William James is another example. Gloria Anzaldúa is a wonderful kind of post-colonial queer example. Amitav Ghosh is a contemporary writer that writes a lot about these states. I mean, my argument is you can go virtually anywhere, including to someone like Jacques Derrida, and just see the superhuman everywhere, if you just open your eyes and are willing to talk about the superhuman and not just endless social conditionings and social states.
Yeah, and nice that you mentioned Nietzsche, of course, and I think good to zoom in a bit on him, because of course we know Nietzsche for his notion of the Übermensch, the superhuman. And I was just wondering, you say a lot about interesting things about this in your book. How is his notion read in the humanities, in the mainstream humanities, the notion of the Übermensch, and how should we read it?
Well, first of all, it's not read.
It isn't even read.
No, the argument is, oh, that's just this tangential crazy idea he had towards the end of his life. It only appears a couple times in his published books. Let's just ignore it, or the eternal recurrence of the same. Oh, that's just a metaphor. It's about taking responsibility for one's life and one's choices. No, those were conclusions he came to because of a mystical experience he had in August of 1881. We know when he had it. We know where he had it. He had it at Sils Maria up in the Alps, and his notion of the superhuman, of the Übermensch, he claimed to have seen the superhumans, the coming superhumans. It wasn't just an abstract idea he had. And he linked it to Darwinian evolution because Darwin had recently, written in 1859, Origin of Species. So, and Nietzsche wasn't a Darwinian, by the way. He thought Darwin and randomness was fairly paltry and puny, as he liked to say, kleine. So his notion of the Superman was this ecstatic vision he had of the future of the species, and it was central to what Nietzsche was about. how it was received, unfortunately what happened is he fell into essentially a coma or a state of brain cancer or madness in about 1889, January of 1889. And his sister, whom he profoundly disagreed with, by the way, took his ideas and sold them sold them metaphorically to people like Mussolini and Hitler and the people who would, kind of take over fascist Europe. And so it was really the Übermensch and Nietzsche who gets picked up by German fascism, really, and that's why it's largely rejected, certainly in the European context. There was a different reception of Nietzsche in the States. The American Nietzsche was not at all like the European Nietzsche, and Nietzsche gets linked to things like sexual activism, gender activism, racial activism, a kind of Jewish intellectualism, to Superman himself, the guy in the blue tights and the red cape. I mean, that all comes from Nietzsche. So there is what I'm trying to say is there are different ways to pick up Nietzsche's Übermensch, and what we've focused on are the really bad ones that in fact did help create really, really bad, horrible things particularly in Europe. But that's not Nietzsche. Nietzsche was basically gone, in 1889. He's not responsible for that. His sister is.
Yeah, it's absolutely true that especially in Europe we link it with fascism. That's just what you do in college. It starts. But I'm just very curious because how super was his Übermensch vision? I mean, how close does it get to the real Superman vision? Or did he mean it more metaphorically than we think? Or
I don't think he meant it metaphorically. I think he was referring to an actual physical superspecies that existed in the future and that would essentially take over or overcome, as he said, the ordinary human species. Nietzsche was really disgusted with European humanity. He thought it was nihilistic, it was without goal, it was without meaning, and his whole project was to overcome this European nihilism. And he felt that the coming Übermensch or the coming superhuman species was the answer to this. It was how we would overcome the nihilism that we were stuck in, in the late 19th century. And it wasn't just the Übermensch, by the way, that the European intellectuals rejected. It was the soul, it was the supernatural, it was the paranormal, it was the occult, it was all kinds of categories that they themselves invented, by the way. It was all European intellectuals who came up with these ideas and these categories, and that all gets kind of conflated with German fascism in Europe, and then just gets rejected outright. And what I'm trying to say is that did not happen in other cultures, and the supernatural or the occult or the paranormal is not dependent in any way on what happened in Germany. It's a universal human potential or attribute, and it gets picked up and talked about and integrated or not integrated in very specific ways.
yeah, I think this is just very interesting to share with people because people have this, I think, materialist interpretation of how Nietzsche meant it, right? Like just a physical, stronger species, because that's sort of the fascist lens that we look at his Übermensch notion. But you are saying he was talking about the paranormal, the psi, the power of mind, of consciousness, etc., right?
Yeah. I mean, if you actually read Nietzsche and you don't just read about him, I mean, this is what shocked me. I mean, I spent my whole professional career reading about Nietzsche, Hans.
Me too.
I didn't read Nietzsche, and I read Freud. I was very much a Freudian, and I love Freud, and I was schooled in psychoanalytic thinking, and so that was my kind of go-to social reductionism, by the way. And I'm still completely there in some sense. But Nietzsche, no, he was just one of many figures I didn't read. And then what happened was a number of my graduate students, their lives were, in one case, saved, and in other cases, completely turned around by simply reading Friedrich Nietzsche. And I was stunned by that, to be really honest. And I was like, wow, something's going on here. I think I better read this author. And I read it, and I was like, who are these people reading? I mean, and by these people, I mean, who are the people who only talk about the naysayer and the reductionist and the God is dead thing? Who exactly are they reading? Because they're not reading the Nietzsche I'm reading. The Nietzsche I'm reading is talking about the uncanny. He's talking about deification. He's talking about ecstasy. He's talking about precognitive dream. He's talking about all the things that I'm very familiar with that come out of these modern paranormal literatures. And he was making really extreme claims about willing backwards and how time repeats itself and a future super species. I mean, these were ideas I swam in the 20th century, and I just assumed, oh, this is Teilhard de Chardin, this is Sri Aurobindo, maybe this is Alfred Russel Wallace, maybe. I had no idea it was all there in Nietzsche, and in a way that was really nuanced and really sophisticated and really critical of what I would call institutional religion or piety. And so
because if everything you're saying right now, if we then sort of reread his whole idea of God is dead, he means then, of course, the God exterior to us, the God we created, that is not us, right? But he's not sort of saying the divine is dead or the transcendent.
Yeah, I mean, what I say in the book is, look, the reason God has to die is that so superhumans can live. We have to stop projecting our own divinity and our own immortality outside of ourselves and then bowing down as if we're some kind of servants or slaves to this monarch in the sky. This is bad. This is really bad. And this is what Nietzsche was objecting to. He objected to religion not because of its extreme claims. He was saying something much more extreme, much more outrageous, frankly. He objected to religion because it made people weak. And, as a scholar of religion, I'm like, yeah, that's true. That's true. That happens. So I was like, oh, he's one of us, But he's like this really extreme version of us that's in which you can kind of see yourself in a new way, I think.
Yeah, and what I like also is, of course, your book goes all over the place, right? Like you go to Egypt, and then you trace sort of the whole notion of the superhuman or the transhuman, and within sort of the fringe of religious traditions, right? So you name, for instance, Hermeticism and Gnosticism. It has been always kept alive, right? So that's maybe nice to just share with people that the whole idea of us being superhumans has been sort of at the core of many traditions, not just and then later, of course, got lost in the mainstream of those religions, but it has always been there, right? That's sort of what I sort of read.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about religion as legitimate science fiction, and by that I mean the German sociologist whose name escapes me right now. I'm sorry, it always escapes me. But
Weber.
No, it wasn't Weber. It was a contemporary sociologist of religion, writing actually when I was in graduate school. I'll think of his name. We can edit this, but his basic argument was, look, religion is about superhuman powers, and it's about accessing those superhuman powers through ascetic practices, through extreme ascetic practices that do things to the body and the mind and actualize these potentials. And then these prodigies that we call saints or mystics then become the core or the carriers of the tradition. And the whole tradition is about obtaining superhuman states of mind and body. And then, of course, as things go on, and in the modern world, we project that superhuman status further and further away from ourselves into some kind of external deity. But that's precisely, again, what I think the humanities are trying to criticize and are trying to become aware of. So I don't think personally we can be humanists without taking seriously that human beings have always had access to these superhuman states and have always tried to access them. I think that's part of our humanity.
And you don't have to convince me, but I mean, if you have to convince your skeptic, like radically skeptic colleagues in the humanities, because you sit on sort of that's how I see you, sitting on sort of this pile of empirical evidence in favor of this, right, of the superhuman. And I mean, how established is this, and how is it that we in the humanities just deny those facts, so to speak?
Well, first of all, I do sit in the margins of the humanities, at least in the States. I really admit that, and I talk about that a lot in the book. I don't want to present the superhumanities as this is what, schools of humanities think and say. It's not exactly not what they say and think. But my argument is, look, it's embedded in the texts we revere and the people we teach every day. So it's encoded into what we're doing, even if we're not admitting that. And I want humanist intellectuals to just be more aware of what it is they're doing and to just read the people that they claim they revere and that they're thinking with. Because I'm very confident that if you read those people carefully and you dig down into their lives and into what produced those texts, you're going to find these states. You're going to find them every time.
Yeah. And to just again zoom in on the super and on the Übermensch, so would that mean that we can all acquire these transcendent states and the capacities that then maybe can be endowed upon you? Clairvoyance, precognition, just the psi stuff, the X-Men stuff, because it is a bit how I read your book. It's like almost this, this we are in a X-Men movie in a sense.
It is X-Men stuff. The X-Men mythology is true, Hans. I mean, it's just true. But the X-Men mythology is derivative, comes out of these historical experiences that have been going on for millennia. I wrote a chapter once in another book called The X-Men Before Their Time. And the X-Men before their time is pretty much everyone. I mean, it's pretty much the history of religions. And again, we've forgotten that, and we've shoved things into entertainment, into science fiction, into superhero comics, so we can somehow, I suppose, deal with it or entertain ourselves. But those myths and that pop culture has a very serious foundation, which is us. And our ancestors, and Nietzsche would add, and our descendants, because for Nietzsche, and I think for a lot of the experiencers I work with, influence doesn't just come from the past into the present; it also comes from the future into the present. Time is a block, and it's all happening all at once, essentially, and I think this is one of the keys to the superhumanities, is that you definitely have a historical consciousness. You think about how things are shaped historically in the past, but you also have a future consciousness. You're willing to entertain influences that might in fact be from the other direction, from the future.
And no, it's just this is maybe a personal side note, but interesting. Your book opened it opened my eyes again to sort of the Protestant background I have versus Catholicism, where of course I'm brought up with the sola fide, and it's just sort of the New Testament scholarship that you also critique, that sort of have sort of took the super away, or tell you that it's not about the super, right? Or you have to believe there once was a super, and that is Christ, and then you can move on, instead of seeing this whole story as sort of something that you could also be or acquire in a sense. And it just never occurred to me to reread the Bible as looking at these miracles as stuff that might have really happened. Which, I mean, if you say that to me a couple of years ago, I thought, no, that's crazy. I left that behind, that literalist belief. But in a sense, you are opening the door, right, to a literal interpretation of these religious stories, which you call sort of this legitimate science fiction.
Well, I'm not sure I'm opening the door to literal readings, because a lot of the miracle stories, of course, are exaggerated or fashioned by many generations and different social contexts. But I certainly am trying to open the door to these things did happen. There's a core truth to the miracle stories that is really important, and that actually generated the charisma and the initial energy of this particular new religious movement that eventually became Christianity. You know, my own conversion to this was, I was trained, probably much like you were, Hans, that anything miraculous or supernatural was legendary and was a later addition to the tradition, and was some kind of power play. Somebody was claiming this to gain some kind of power, usually of an institutional or political form. And then what happened was, I wrote this book on the human potential movement in the US, based in California in the 60s and 70s. And I talked to all these people when I was writing that book, and they were telling me crazy stories. I mean, just things I knew there was no way that could happen. But I knew that happened. I knew they were telling me.
Just to give an example?
Well, here's an example. So a woman, for example, is giving birth to her first child, and she feels this intense pressure in the bottom of her spine, and she essentially has what I think we would today call a Kundalini awakening. And she ends up leaving her body and watching herself from the ceiling have this child. And it just blows her away because she has no context for this. She thinks she's going crazy. And she ends up finding a man named Joe Campbell, who helps her, integrate this through this language of Kundalini and yoga and all this. And it suddenly starts to make sense to her, or doesn't suddenly, it gradually makes sense to her. I mean, people were talking about what we would now call UFO contacts. They were talking about alien abductions. They were talking about dreams of future events that played out in perfect detail. I mean, just a whole gamut of stuff. And I realized that these people were telling me the truth. And I also realized that we, as scholars of religion, had no way of really understanding what was going on. All we could do is write it off. And I also realized that if these people are having these experiences in 2005, they could have had them 2,000 years ago in Palestine or in the Mediterranean world. In fact, they obviously did. So it made me rethink the history of religions, that it's not based on a series of illusions or hallucinations or wild claims, that it's actually based on a set of actual human experiences that then, of course, get mythologized and exaggerated and ritualized and institutionalized in all the ways we know, but that there's a core truth there that frankly shocked me, but also liberated me as a kind of intellectual trying to understand what religion is. Because otherwise we just reduce religion to bad politics, right? I mean, it's just a bunch of people who have the wrong political views.
It's becoming boring to just read it in that way, right? That sort of Paul went through the Greek world and attributed all these capacities to Jesus just to sell the story, right? That's just sort of this cynical sort of, and there might be some truth to it, but there has to be something. And to me, Jeffrey, I'm just curious if you are familiar with if he was also part of that human potential movement, or even if you ever met Ramdas, Richard Alpert, it was sort of, I at a moment became sort of obsessed, or just listening to his lectures, and he told a lot about his guru in India, I think Karoli Baba, and those were like biblical miracle stories. That's just beyond precognition. That no, you materialize food out of nothing to like Jesus, and coming from Richard Alpert, how he told it, I just had to take it serious in a sense. Like, okay, this stuff is happening, and it's happening now.
Well, I think you can just remove the maybe. I mean, this stuff is happening, and it does happen, and let's talk about it. Let's integrate it into our theories about what's going on. Let's stop pretending that it isn't happening, because of course it's happening. And with Richard, I first of all never met Richard Alpert, but I knew a lot of his friends, by the way. I knew them personally. And one of the real catalysts of that whole scene was psychedelics. And of course, we're in a kind of psychedelic renaissance right now. But I'm pretty sure that if you removed the psychedelic catalyst, you wouldn't have a lot of these events. And it doesn't mean that the events can be explained by the psychedelic. I'm not making that argument. But I am making the argument that you need catalysts often to induce these states. And Richard Alport, who became Ram Dass, of course, is very clear about the role that psychedelics played in his early spiritual life. And it was very much a part of the human potential movement, by the way, that I was studying as well. It wasn't the whole thing by any stretch, but it was certainly in the mix.
It's very interesting to make that bridge to the psychedelic renaissance, because what I'm now sensing, I visited a conference in the Netherlands. We have this sort of international conference on psychedelic research, which really brings together sort of the whole research community, international community. It's a great event. And I noticed how much there's now openness to speak about the mystical experiences that the substances induce. But there is also a very strong hesitance to go into sort of the ontological implications of that, right? And then this brings me back to your book. There's a lot of talk about William James, of course, but sort of the James that you, again, like Nietzsche say, it's just one part of James, because he himself was open sort of to the ontological implications, right? Just nice to hear your thoughts here.
Yeah, I mean, again, William James is another one of these humanists that we all read, I suppose, in graduate school or undergraduate school. And, I read a lot of William James. I read him all through graduate school. Nobody ever told me, ever, that he was an avid psychical researcher, and that he spent days and weeks and months with mediums and psychics. And no, we were not told that. We were given the respectable William James, the William James the pragmatist, William James the author of The Varieties of Religious Experience. We were not given the William James that actually lived and existed and thought. And I think, again, if you read enough into James, what you realize is, this guy's sucking on nitrous oxide. Where is he getting nitrous oxide, for one thing? Like, come on. I mean, he's clearly doing this on purpose. He's clearly altering his own consciousness. And he had this great story, which I love. It was after he had imbibed some nitrous oxide. And he said, Hegel finally made sense to me. And then the nitrous oxide wore off, and Hegel no longer made sense to him. And I'm like, that's it. That's what I mean by the superhumanities, is that these texts that we read are themselves altered states. And they make sense in altered states that they can induce or that we can induce in ourselves, but they may make very little sense outside those altered states. So I think James is a kind of exemplar of what I mean by the superhumanities. He's read and used in the humanities, but he was actually interested in the superhuman, a word he used, by the way, all the time. He used it constantly, particularly towards the end of his life. And again, we just don't hear about that William James. It's
Yeah,
just
so just to
erased.
clarify for people who are not familiar, so the pragmatist James told us to sort of take these experiences seriously, but you just see how they sort of, what effect they have on individuals or society, right? And whereas that's only the pragmatist approach, but you can also take sort of a more metaphysical route. It's like, okay, what are these experiences telling us about the fundamental nature of who we are,
Well, and
right?
towards the end of his life, he went there. He wrote ontologically, he wrote metaphysically, and he didn't claim to know the truth of things, but he sort of landed on what we would call a panpsychism. He really landed on a kind of cosmic mind that sort of dribbles itself into Hans and Jeff, and so we're like little bubbles, or Bernardo would say we're alters of this larger cosmic mind. That was like pure William James towards the end of his life, and he concluded that because of his decades studying mediums and psychics and mystics. I mean, this was really his sort of final conclusion. Then before he died in, I think, 1910 is when he died. But that he was really going there towards the end of his life.
Yeah, that's so. And to you mentioned panpsychism, and I was reading, of course, your book also with sort of the metaphysical lens from the Essentia Foundation, so sort of the idealism in there, and it struck me that so much is just like in plain accordance with like hardcore analytic idealism, in a sense. But curious to hear your thoughts here. But maybe nice to also just share the sort of the whole lineage, because you start with ancient Egypt, Hermeticism. You of course go to Plato, and then sort of scholasticism in medieval periods, and then we get to Kant, Schopenhauer. But it seems to me like one big idealist story until the 19th century, and then we took a sort of a different route.
I think so. I think you're right, Hans. I think the fundamental position of philosophers and mystical writers before certainly the 19th century was idealism, or some form of idealism. Of course, there are different forms of it. I think after the 19th century, with the rise of materialism, and in the 20th century with the rise of computer modeling of the mind and a kind of reductive neuroscience, idealism essentially gets exiled, as we all know. But it's still popping through the floorboards in the 20th century. It's still obvious to people who are having these kinds of altered states. And then in the 21st century, of course, I think it's kind of on a comeback. I know it is, largely because of Bernardo Castro, by the way. So I don't generally identify as an idealist, Hans. I identify as a dual aspect monist, but I think that is an idealist. I mean, in my weaker moments, or maybe they're my stronger moments, I'm like, I think God is just idealism for the masses. I really do. I think it's just a way of talking about idealism, but not really owning it and projecting it outwards. And dual aspect monism basically just says that what we experience as mental is also material, and what we experience as material is also mental, because the mental and the material arise from some common kind of super source, which is neither mind nor matter. So to me, that's a form of idealism, really, even though it's a little different, I suppose, as well. And I like that model because it helps me keep more things on the table. I like models that keep things on the table, and I don't like models that take things off the table. Right? So when somebody has a profound synchronicity, in other words, something happens in the material world that corresponds perfectly to something happening in the mental world, to me, dual aspect monism instantly authorizes that. When someone says, "Oh, that can't happen. That means nothing. That's an accident," I'm like, "Well, that doesn't jive with what these people are saying. Or when someone says, oh, you can't have a precognitive dream, or you can't know what someone else's mind is. I'm like, yeah, but these things happen. So I object to models that take things off our table. And I want to embrace models that keep things on, but I don't know which model's correct. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. And in some sense, I'm not sure it matters which model's correct as long as we keep all those things on the table.
Yeah, but that's something different than saying that you're agnostic, right? I found interesting how you critique sort of that agnostic position that sort of we see nowadays. I think, for instance, in psychedelic research, that there are not many people who will identify as a materialist because they see, but going towards sort of saying I'm a panpsychist or an idealist is also a way. So they take this sort of pragmatic attitude of saying I'm agnostic, and you critique that, right, in your book. You say that's not a position, or
yeah, I mean
it is a position, but
there are different forms of agnosticism, some of which I really like, and some of which I'm very critical of. If someone's agnostic because they say that the fundamental nature of reality is unknowable, I'm like, okay, I get that. That's what we call an apophatic understanding in mystical literature, and that makes a lot of sense to me. But when someone says I'm agnostic about X, Y, or Z, what they really mean is I'm not going to take a position. And my critique of that is, well, the dial's just all reset to materialism when you say that. You can be as agnostic as you want, but really what you're saying is let's let materialism be and let's pretend that it's okay and that it works, when it doesn't. So stop being agnostic. Stop being like that. You can be humble and admit you don't know the answer, but you can't be completely agnostic because it's a non-position, and it's materialism in disguise, is I suppose what I'm trying to say.
Not many people are sort of identifying in the humanities as being like hardcore materialists, but they'll use different words. For instance, in the psychedelic community, they say they're talking about naturalism, right? Because it sounds a bit softer than materialism, but when you hear them out, it's just a materialist position. So it seems to me that we are already in a paradigm shift. How far away are the superhumanities?
The humanities are pretty far. They're way behind. I'll give you an example. I mean, this is a funny example. I have a dear friend, Eric Wargo is his name, and Eric writes about precognitive dreams mostly. And he theorizes this block universe, and he makes the argument that he's a materialist. And the reason he's a materialist is that for him, a precognitive dream is your future physical brain communicating with itself back into the present. So there's no physical space between this brain and my brain tomorrow. It's the same brain. And I just tease Eric. I'm like, well, Eric, look, if you're a materialist, then I love materialists. I mean, it's a wonderful form of materialism because you keep precognition on the table. You don't take it off. So that's a form of naturalism, I suppose, that I can certainly embrace and certainly use. But naturalism, again, to me, it's kind of a cop-out, to be honest, Hans, because for one thing, there is no such thing as nature. There's no such thing as matter. You don't solve these problems by just saying I'm a naturalist and that everything's material, because nothing's material. Even things that look material are not material. So it's like, come on, let's come up with new words. Or someone will say, well, this is a new materialism. I'm like, well, it's still a materialism. Just can't we come up with a different word? Can't we come up with a different category and not just add a new to something, or a neo, and pretend everything's okay now, when it's just not.
I think it's a sign that sort of we are in a sort of the anomalies are popping up. Isn't this like classic Kuhn, if you did the nature of scientific revolutions, right?
Yeah.
That when these anomalies happen, people will invent sort of these new words just to not sort of having to integrate these anomalies.
Yeah.
So I think something like that is at play. But I wanted to talk also about what you call the immunological response of the humanities, right? When it comes to this, so what do you mean with that, and what are the sort of the core aspects of that sort of
Well,
immunological response?
yeah, I just mean the way humanists normally respond to these claims or these experiences. I think the primary immunological response is to ignore them, simply not to talk about them, to pretend they don't exist. And that's actually very effective. Because then you can spend all your time and energy, talking and writing and teaching about other things. But they don't go away because you ignore them. And people who have these experiences are really frustrated and they're really shocked because they don't fit in to these natural material models that people keep assuming are adequate. I think the other immunological response to these claims is the European response that, oh, well, the Übermensch equals fascism. That's an immunological response. But again, it's simply not true. But it's certainly true enough in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. So I think there's a lot to work around or to work through. And I think there are real moral objections. The essential moral objection in the humanities to all of these states is that they take us away from real social criticism and real moral activism. They take us out of the world, out of the social world, and they place value and meaning in some other dimension or some other realm, and they don't result in the critique and the changing of moral values. Okay, well, that's a real objection. That's serious, and I understand that. And that's why the Superhumanities always includes the humanities. It always includes this, what I call the prophetic dimension, this critique of class and race and gender and sexuality and environment. Those are really important components to what I call the Superhumanities.
Yeah, this is a very, very strong point you make in the book. We could also say it goes by the name of spiritual bypassing, right? That you do sort of your psychedelic trips and all your sort of breath work and your yoga, but you don't change the world, and you just buy books about all that. I mean, I don't have to go sort of the caricature of that, but that's quite a strong critique, and I find it sort of it's tragic in a sense, because by sort of that nomer of spiritual bypassing, we do not take serious the potential that all of this has for social change, right, and justice.
Right. I mean, there's two ways I deal with that in the book. I also talk about moral bypassing. Just because just because you focus on the spiritual and bypass the moral doesn't mean you can only focus on the moral and bypass the spiritual. One bypassing doesn't resolve another. It just creates a different focus and a different set of values, which might be good at a particular moment. But the deeper move, Hans, is that I personally think that what a paranormal event is when a social system is not working properly and there's some kind of human suffering or some kind of social injustice that is embedded in the system. And it's that disjunction or that not working that then manifests as the haunting or the paranormal experience. And so if you actually look at the history of moments when the paranormal was really evident, at least in American history, these are moments of radical social change. And these are moments of radical social critique. And so I personally think that focusing on the paranormal is itself a kind of social activism, is itself a kind of moral activism. But I do understand that it doesn't have to be, and that it can lead elsewhere. And I suppose my response is so what? Let some people focus on the social and let other people focus on the paranormal, and we're good. Not everybody is going to be interested in the same thing, nor should they be, but let's do it all. Let's not just do one of those. That's really my response. And it comes out of my own Catholic background, by the way. I'm very aware that in the history of Catholicism, there was this big debate in the medieval church between whether the proper Christian life was the monastic contemplative life or whether it was the active life of charity and good works. And of course, different religious orders were founded with different emphases. And there was never any resolution of that question. It was just this tension in the tradition. And of course, the life of contemplation is important. And of course, the life of charity is important. But you can't do both at the same time. You've got to do one or the other. And so different communities can focus on different charisms, as it were. And I really think of the humanities in this sort of Catholic sense, I guess, that, look, we have different disciplines, we have different departments, we have different intellectuals. They can do and should do different things.
Yeah, that's very realistic, I think, in your book, sort of, and you call that also the human as two, right? Could you sort of unpack that a bit?
Yeah, I talk about the human as two a lot, and I think sometimes it's confused that I somehow think there's some kind of transcendent floating balloon, called the soul, and then there's the body, and then there's society, and isn't it a bummer kind of thing. I don't think that at all. I don't even think there are two things. On the other hand, I do think that most of our lives are lived in a social framework, and we live in relationship, and we have to negotiate different moral values in a particular social system. And that some of us, when we get really ill or when we're about to die or when we take a psychedelic, we have these experiences of deification and cosmic transcendence. And I think both of those things are true. And so that's why I keep harping on this human as two. It's not to say just focus on the transcendent cosmic experience. It's say, no, you are both of these things, so be both. And maybe in this life, 99.9% of your attention should be focused on the social and the ethical and the moral. But that other percentage, that's not social. That's probably not moral in the way you think of it. It's probably not embodied in the way you think of it. It's something else. And so that's really what the human as two means, is that most of our lives are spent in this social context, but that there are always these sort of superhuman altered states that are important too.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you just a moment ago said that it seems as if these states present themselves more at crucial times in sort of the human history. Would you say that we are at such time at this moment in history?
I think so. I mean, so I wrote this book about the human potential movement, and this was still when people read books and when people still went on book tours, by the way. And I went on this book tour, and the number one question I got was, how do we do this again? And the question really was, how do we do the counterculture again? And my response was, I don't know. My response was, you can't do it again. The zeitgeist is the zeitgeist. But I think we're moving into a zeitgeist today that is very fraught. If you talk to young people in particular in the classroom, they're very disturbed by political polarization, at least in the U.S. I'm speaking about the U.S. here. They're fraught about political polarization. They're fraught about the environment. They're fraught around gender and sexuality and race. They're fraught around a lot of things. And I think what you see, again, in the U.S. is some of this, at least, is manifesting, frankly, in the UFO or UAP phenomenon that is in Congress now, of all places. And that means it's in the military, and that means it's in the intelligence communities. So these sort of classical paranormal issues are entering the mainstream in a way that I find fascinating, and to me suggests that we're in another kind of period of radical social transition. And I think we are, but I don't claim to know where that's going or whether that will go well.
Would you? It reminds me. I've been reading Jung. Sort of just started reading Jung this year, but wasn't that Jung who also thought of the UFO as sort of a suppressed content of the subconscious? And I mean, how do you see that then? I mean, what do you make of it metaphysically, Jeffrey? I mean, the non-human anomalous.
So Jung wrote his flying saucer book towards the end of his life. I think it came out in 1958. And if you read that book, and I've read it carefully, what's fascinating about that book is that he cannot determine whether the flying saucer is a physical thing or a spiritual or psychological thing. And his conclusion is that it's both. He calls it psychoid. And his essential argument is that the flying saucer mythology in the 1950s was a kind of planetary poltergeist. It was a kind of haunting that was a part of the Cold War, really. And I think he was right about that, actually. And I think today that Cold War mythology doesn't work so well. The alien invasion narrative, as I call it, doesn't work very well. And I think you're starting to see that in some of the movies like Arrival. It breaks with that, by the way. But I think in Congress and the military, the U.S. military today, they're still caught in that Cold War narrative. And so you have lots of language about threats, and you have lots of language about shooting things down. And it's a terrible mistake. You don't shoot UFOs down, by the way. It's like shooting down souls. It makes no sense. But I think it's really important that conversation is happening and that it's at least in our public media in some way.
It's super fascinating. I've not gone very deep into the rabbit hole, but it's just fascinating how it now is sort of entering.
It's a rabbit hole. It's a rabbit hole inside a rabbit hole inside a rabbit hole. I mean, it's. But you cannot study the UFO, or as they want to call it today, the UAP, without engaging the paranormal. No. It will hit you like a ton of bricks, but people try.
I find it.
People try to ignore it.
I find it just very interesting from a metaphysical perspective, because if these phenomena seem to violate or clearly violate, and we have empirical findings that they clearly violate the laws of physics as we know them, just the laws of Newton when it comes to motion. So we clearly know that. So then to uphold a sort of a materialist view upon these phenomena, it's just, I think it won't bring you very far. And that to me is very interesting, because what is it then, right? Is it in consciousness presenting itself to us from other dimensions? It's just fascinating. Yeah.
You know, and to go back to Bernardo Kastrup, I mean, one of the things I really admired about really all of his books, but even early on in his early books on absurdity and dreamed up reality, he hits the UFO phenomena head on. And he uses it as kind of as a metaphor or a symbol for idealism, really. And I think in a very powerful way. And really that's what I think the phenomenon's calling for is for us to really change our view of reality. At the end of the day, I think that's what this is about. It's a shift in worldview, to use the Kuhnian language.
Yeah, and you said earlier, like the in Catholicism, and your own background, sort of the monastic life versus the sort of activist life doing charity, and that you cannot do both. But don't we see sort of in these central figures in history, social activists? I mean, you also in your book mention Martin Luther and Malcolm X, or Francis of Assisi, who seem to do both in a sense. How important is the super for social change at this moment in time? Because it seems that we really need it. We need it sort of for justice, for climate, all the problems we face.
I think we do. I think our problems partly stem from our exclusive focus on difference. You know, everybody's different, everything's different, and therefore there's nothing to link us or to unite us. And I think we desperately need some story that links us, that unites us. I think that's the real challenge. And I think, you know, to go back, I apologize for talking about the UFO again, but that's a story that links us. It's something that comes out of the sky in the heavens, and it frankly doesn't care about our borders or our social identities. It just shows up anywhere, and it's as apparent in the global south as it is the global north. It just doesn't care. And I think that's really healthy, actually. And so I think I see that, again, not as the myth or the mythology or the worldview of the future, but as a way of pushing us towards some kind of worldview that unites us or connects us and doesn't separate us.
And how do you just regard it metaphysically? Is it sort of our own subconscious? Is it our own higher self? Is it
How do I explain our dismissal of metaphysics?
no, these anomalous, the UFO phenomena. I mean, what is your metaphysical take on them?
Oh, I think they're us from the future. I mean, that's really what I think at the end of the day. If you gave me enough beer, you haven't, by the way, but if you gave me enough beer, I would say it's us. And I think once you put into the equation some kind of time manipulation, a lot of the manifestations make a lot of sense. How that's done, I haven't a clue, you know. And but to me, to go back to Nietzsche, the alien presence looks a lot like some kind of super species that's us from the future, frankly. And it gets demonized a lot. It's turned into literal demons by a lot of religious people. But that's, of course, exactly what Nietzsche thought, too. He called himself the Antichrist, and he praised evil because, you know, he saw it as the future. And I also can't help thinking about my meat eating, by the way. We kill millions of animals every day so that we can consume meat, have hamburgers and steaks and things, and we must be evil to cows. Or, you know, I go to the veterinarian with my furry housemate named Delilah, and how do they understand us? You know, how does this interspecies thing work? And so it seems to me evil and the demonic doesn't really solve anything because it's really everywhere. I think every species is a demon to another species that it consumes or relies on in some way.
Yeah. And just a bit of sort of a different theme, but very important. We haven't touched very much upon Foucault, who plays also an important role in your book as a central figure in the humanities. And I like you quote. You say something about, what was it again? You call him sort of a moon, sort of a moonlight, and that behind that moon shines the exploding sun of Nietzsche, which I really found funny to read. But just to summarize sort of Foucault for people who are not familiar with him, he was the guy who taught us sort of to deconstruct things, right? And to show us that everything is a construct of.
Yeah, I'm not a Foucauldian scholar, but certainly the way Michel Foucault has been received in the humanities is that everything is fundamentally about power, including forms of knowledge. That orders of knowledge are built up around privilege and forms of institutional power, and these lines of power are largely invisible and unconscious. So it's not like people are personally responsible for X, Y, or Z, but they're embedded in these networks of power and knowledge that privilege some people and deprivilege others. And Foucault himself was most interested in himself, in his own queer sexuality, and the way it did not fit in to the norms, the heterosexual norms of certainly European society and Christian society. And so he thought a lot about queer sexualities and other forms of gender that don't fit in to the orders of power and knowledge. He also was very eloquent about what he called technologies of the self, which were essentially forms of reflection and self-consciousness that developed mostly through practices of penance and Christian meditation. So he's I think Foucault is easily the most quoted figure in the humanities today. I mean, he's just everywhere. He's certainly in the study of religion. He's in the study of literature. He's in philosophy departments. He's very much dominant, I would say.
And religion, in his take, sort of this as sort of power and construction. Where's his metaphysics? I mean, what was Foucault's ontology?
Well, to my knowledge, he doesn't talk about a metaphysical position. Which is very, very much the norm. You don't do metaphysics. You don't do meta narratives. That's the basic point of the postmodern turn, is that metaphysics are hegemonic and they essentially control people. And so we don't talk about what reality is. We talk about how knowledge is ordered, or how power is constructed, or how words work. And the reason Nietzsche is Nietzschean is that power was really central to Nietzsche in terms of the will. And Foucault inherits that really from Nietzsche, but he removes all of what I would call all the mystical states that were so important to Nietzsche. The person who doesn't, by the way, is Georges Bataille. If you read any of Bataille is another French thinker in the 50s and 60s, predates Foucault, but nobody reads Georges Bataille. They all read Michel Foucault, and that to me is another way the strictly the humanities have subsumed the superhumanities and made them normal. Bataille was very much into mystical states and felt that death and eroticism in particular were the main means of subsuming the ego back into some kind of continuity that was essentially mystical. And he himself was an atheist and very much a materialist, but was just obsessed with altered states of consciousness, very much as I'm talking about or predict in the book. I don't talk about Bataille, but I certainly could have. But we don't read Bataille, we read Foucault.
Yeah, that's interesting. And that Foucauldian sort of view on religion and in religion studies, that sort of really, that's also one of your points, sort of how sort of comparative studies of religion, we just don't do that in a sort of metaphysical sense, that we just try to see, hey, maybe there's truth here among these different traditions and how could they sort of be combined. And instead we see them all as cultural constructions in a certain cultural historical context, right?
Well, I don't know how much Foucault really thought about world religions or how much he knew about them. Certainly ancient Greece and ancient Christianity. But certainly the study of religion, at least as I was trained in it and as it's existed in the last 30 years, has been very much about what I call the horizontal. You look at religion as a function or a part of society and how it shapes people and how the self is located in a particular social network. You never talk about the vertical. You never talk about transcendence or revelation. There can be no such thing. All that revelation or transcendence means is a representation in this social system that exists on a flat, two-dimensional plane, as it were. And this third dimension of up, just don't talk about it. It doesn't exist. And I don't think intellectuals will say it doesn't exist, but they certainly won't talk about it in a way that I think we should be talking about it.
I was thinking there is sort of this interesting stick you can use nowadays. I mean, it's all about sort of being inclusive and diversity. And if you would apply that to metaphysics or ontology, then I mean, we have to be much more inclusive of other traditions and their ontology in trying to understand.
Well, this is the argument.
Yeah,
This is the argument, Hans, I make in the book, right?
yeah,
I
yeah.
talk about decolonizing reality, and I'm like, look, you can't pretend you're being diverse and then turn everybody into a good Marxist. That you can't pretend that it's just a flat social plane, because that's your metaphysics. That's European Marxist criticism from the 19th and 20th century. If you're really going to be diverse, you have to take these other ontological claims as claims on reality, not as representations or language games that you can play around with, but claims on reality that impinge on your reality as well. And so the joke I tell is this, the Buddha, the Buddha taught the impermanence of all things and the non-existence of the self, but it turns out it was just to lower our blood pressure and to make us, better office workers. That's how he gets received in this flat world. And I'm like, no, that is not Buddhism, or at least that was not the Buddhist traditions I was trained in. They were making an argument about the non-existence of the self and the impermanence of all things, including you, including me. That's an ontological claim. That's a religious tradition, not this, let's calm you down and lower your blood pressure and make you fit better into your own professional world. I mean, that's nonsense. He didn't fit, by the way. The Buddhist tradition, they became monks for a reason. It was not to fit in. It wasn't to fit in. And of course, then they fit in by forming the cultures around the monasteries. But that's another story.
Yeah, but it's the term, I like that. I didn't read that book, but the Mac mindfulness, right? It's the sort of taking this into our capitalist system and then a sort of like cynical functionalist approach.
Well, yeah, and I know some of those people. I don't think they're cynical at all. I think they're very genuine, but they're very much part of this capitalist social system that we're talking about. And I don't think that the full ontological force of Buddhist impermanence or nirvana is part of what they're doing.
You talk about race theory and the full richness of sort of the black community, for instance, and the ontology that they can bring, sort of that there's this danger, right, that we don't take that into account.
No, of course not. And black intellectuals, black literary history, black religion, it's extremely diverse ontologically again. I mean, the Afro-pessimism movement is a philosophical tradition essentially on one end of the spectrum that basically says racism is systemic. It's systemic to cultures around the world. We're probably not going to change it. Racism is endemic to human beings for whatever reason. Where on the other end of the spectrum, you have something like the Afrofuturist movement in art and music and literature, and it's very much about the black body and the black person as the paranormal generator of social change and the future, really. And I think you get this whole spectrum. And certainly in black religions, rituals like divination and possession and ecstatic trance, I mean, these are all just in the natural kind of, in the water kind of phenomena that I think the academy tends to flatten again. And I want to say, no, these are about transcendence. These are about possession. These are about what they say they're about. These are not social representations that you can fit into your particular Marxist or Foucauldian or Freudian or whatever it is worldview. You cannot fit these into your worldview. So let them be and let them challenge what it is you think and who you are. So I would say the same thing about these black traditions as I would say about the world religions, that real diversity is ontological diversity and not just racial or gendered or sexual or ecological diversity.
Yeah, it's a very important point. And if you fantasize about the superhumanities, Jeffrey, how would a day in college look like if sort of the superhumanities are the mainstream?
Well, I do fantasize, and I joke, of course. I've also thought a lot about my colleagues and myself and my graduate students, and why people get into the study of religion, why people become humanists at all. And essentially what they do is they back into it. They grow up in a culture or a family, they have some kind of question that their family or their culture can't answer or won't let them ask, and they back into the academy because it allows them to ask that question. And my joke is, look, I've never run into a kid who grew up wanting to be a professor of religion, or much less a professor of the humanities. I mean, what is that? But if we called the humanities the superhumanities, I can imagine a lot of kids wanting to grow up and be superhumans. I mean, I don't know Europe at all, but we just had Halloween here in the States, and every other kid was dressed as a superhuman. I mean, it was like crazy. So I think we have a serious marketing problem, to be really blunt and I guess banal about it. And I want us to start speaking in ways that are attractive and bring in more people into what we do, because I think what we do is really important. It's not just about the superhuman, it's also about history, it's about society, it's about morality, it's about technology, it's about all the things that human beings do. And I think it's cool. I think it's really cool, Hans.
Yeah, it's amazing.
And I think
you're absolutely right. You don't want to become a professor of religion. You want to become a mystic, a mutant. You want to become sort of you have the superpowers. And that's what I find so absolutely amazing about sort of the psychedelic community, that you have an access to these states. And I think in our previous conversation, we discussed how in sort of my upbringing, and I've also been to evangelical churches, that the transcendent state was sort of through the grace of God, and the psychedelics are your birthright. It's just eating a plant, and it will get you there, right? And I really think that that was one of my questions, actually. Don't you think that the superhumanities outside of academia are very much happening? I'm not talking about the mystics, but I'm talking about, for instance, business consulting. I see in the Netherlands, for instance, these communities of people who will do like shamanic work with horses. They go to psychedelic retreats. And these are high-level, CEO-level people who take this serious, right? And who really experience personal growth through these practices. So you could say that the the superhumanities are very much sort of active there, and it's just academia that's lagging behind.
I think so. I mean, again, that's my banal comment about we have a marketing problem. Of course, it's everywhere. And because this is what a human being is, Hans. A human being is a superhuman. And all human beings have this access. And the reason psychedelics are so powerful, they work, by the way. They don't always work, but they certainly work a lot of the times. Is not because of God, but because we have these potentials in us, and we just need the right plant catalyst, and boom, there we are. Turns out we don't need the grace of God or an external deity. That's the superhuman, by the way. Again, that's Nietzsche. So yeah, I think so. I think they're everywhere, but they're not named as such, of course. What the superhumanities do is they make us rigorous and reflexive about things that are happening all the time, everywhere.
And do we need a sort of different methodology? Because, of course, you cannot sort of apply empirical science in a way. If we have to take, for instance, these states serious, you have to rely on anecdotal stories, right? So can we sort of apply science in the same way?
So I'm not sure I understand your question, but I think I do. I'm often heard, I think, as anti-science. I'm not at all. but I want science to be science. And I don't want it to make claims that are not scientific. And I think science is very good about studying and mathematizing objects out there and predicting their behavior. I think it's really bad at describing internal states of the mind or subjectivity. But I think the humanities are in fact very good at that. And this is why I keep saying you have to integrate the humanities into the sciences and the sciences into the humanities. You can't do one or the other. You need to do both. And this, by the way, is why I'm a dual aspect monist, because again, that material world, which is the realm of the sciences, and that mental realm, which is the realm of the humanities, both emerge from this deeper super source. So I am a big fan of the sciences, but I don't think for 1 second that they're adequate, and nor will they ever be. But I don't think the humanities will ever be adequate either, or the religions, and this is, again, a kind of hard message.
And where are you sort of on the idea of science and spirituality coming together, or that there can be this symbiosis? For instance, I talked to Donald Hoffman, and you also referred to his work in your book, of course. And he said, I really like that. He said sort of that the way that religions and spiritual teachers have taught us about how to get to these states, or what these states are, and the esoteric language they use and the vagueness very often, is not something to be proud of. He says it's not something to be proud of. We have to be sort of rigorous. And then Donald wants to sort of capture it in math, right? He has this hope of getting outside of space-time and finding the math. What are your thoughts there? I really like sort of that attitude, right? I don't know if it's...
Yeah, I love Donald Hoffman. He makes me laugh, I mean, his early work on... his basic argument was that we have to stop thinking in terms of 19th century science. We have to catch up and realize that we don't think what we used to think. But in his book too, and in his work, he draws a lot on the humanities. He draws a lot on The Matrix, for example, which is a science fiction film, and he draws a lot on Plato's Cave, which is, of course, the classic parable of the academy. And so I think he's using philosophy, and he's using the humanities all along, but I also think the sciences can add a rigor and a discipline to this fuzziness that he's critiquing. I agree with that critique. But I also think, I talk a lot about what I call the tyranny of clarity. I think there's something about clarity that eliminates what we're trying to get at. I think these states often appear in apparitions and visions and profoundly symbolic states that are very confusing. And to make everything clear and neat is to, frankly, erase what's trying to appear. Because I think what's happening is one level of consciousness is trying to communicate with another, and there is no clarity. It doesn't work.
There's no model there. This reminds me also about what you say about McGilchrist's work, right? The left and right hemisphere. You're trying.
Yeah, the left brain. The left brain wants the right brain to be the left brain. I'm like, no, it's not. It's just not going to do that.
And sort of, are we trapped? Are the humanities now trapped? That was what I wrote down. Sort of also as a question, trapped in left hemisphere thinking.
I think they are at the moment, yeah. But again, Hans, people die. People retire, things move on, generations click over, things change, and not always for the better. I'm not suggesting that, but my own faith, if I have any faith in the future, it's in younger intellectuals and it's in future intellectuals. I don't have as much faith in older generations or my own generation, because I think they're trapped in the training of the 1970s and 80s, which I think was very useful but inadequate. I think the younger generations, I think they have different questions. And I think a lot of the things that were simply off the table for my mentors are back on the table for them. And I think that's hopeful in the end. I think that's a good thing.
I see that change happening in your students because you work with students, right, daily.
I do. I see that happening. Going back to the Superman Clark Kent parable, I use that to talk to my graduate students because they come to us to be Superman. They've had some altered state and they want to talk about how those altered states work in history. And again, I think it's our goal to help them be Clark Kent, but I don't want them just to be Clark Kent either. I want them to go in the phone booth and be Superman and Clark Kent. And so I see that as a very hopeful shift, that young people are coming and wanting essentially to study the superhumanities. They don't actually want to study the humanities alone, because why? I mean, okay, they can do certain things, but to give your whole life to them and to spend 7 years at a school, then you probably won't ever get a job. I mean, it takes a lot of internal oomph to do that, I think.
Yeah, and hearing you talk like this, it also makes me think that sort of the humanities are subject-object thinking, you thinking that you can study sort of the society or a certain sort of, and whereas the superhumanities, you are it, and you to study it is to become it, or to go into these states, right? Because I don't think you're suggesting that the superhumanities would be just studying these states. Because when these students say I want to be Superman, they don't say I want to study Superman, I want to become it, right?
Well, they want to do both. They want to have these altered states, but they also want to understand these altered states. Remember, just because you have an altered state doesn't mean you can integrate it into your life. It doesn't mean it makes any sense, And so I think what young people want is they want both a framework in which these altered states make some sense, but they also want the altered states. And, I say that a lot. One of the things I say a lot is, look, we already have enough dots. What we need are ways to connect the dots and form pictures. We need a framework that makes these things sort of obvious and meaningful. We don't necessarily need more dots. We have a lot of dots, by the way, more than we'll ever be able to use, I think.
I'm wondering about the tension between the two, right? The altered state and integrating it in one's life, us being sort of just the social creatures and us being it and the one, and the boundary between the two. And just to make it personal, I mean, I've mainly through psychedelics, I must be honest, had these highly altered states, and of course, it's difficult to integrate them, and I keep on sort of, it's as if you have to make this dance and I want to balance it, right? I want to balance sort of having these states, integrate them and find this sort of balance, but I'm like either very much into sort of that whole, in just the psychedelic weirdness, or I'm very much in the human. How do you see that, and how does it work for you?
Well, okay, I'm going to say something.
Couple questions here, sorry. Yeah.
No, I'm going to say something probably a little surprising, but I don't think integration's possible. I actually think that's fine. What I'm after is plausibility. I'm after a framework that makes these things possible. I don't think they can ever be fully integrated into one's social life. That's why I talk about the humanists too. And when people talk to me about balance and integration and all these wonderful social things, I'm like, yeah, whatever. That's boring. I mean, if you want a boring life, go be integrated, but you're not going to be interesting. This is way more interesting. And I just think that's true. I think if you look at the lives of what we call the saints and the mystics, they were messed up people. But they were really interesting. And their lives were meaningful, and I don't think they generally ever achieved integration. But so what? I mean, again, so I don't think it matters, and I don't think it's possible. What I hear from experiencers, to kind of go back, because I've had a few experiencers, to speak personally again. I've done the psychedelic thing. I've had the out-of-body experience. I've done all that. I know what that is, and that's really important because it makes me sympathetic when people talk to me. But when people talk to me, what they're most interested in is someone who can give them a model of reality in which what happened to them is possible. They are not looking for integration, Hans. They are not looking for some kind of professional success. They are looking for a worldview in which what happened to them is not so shocking. You know, that's what they most want. And so I think that's what we should be about as intellectuals. And as people who are experts on the word, I think we should be creating a new poetics and a new language to make what I call the impossible possible. That's really the goal for me. Now, having said that, let me add another wrinkle into this, which you have not brought up, but I really want to bring up. Not every experience of the superhuman is positive, right? Sometimes the superhuman haunts us and possesses us and even harms us. Sometimes it destroys us. And I want to acknowledge that, and I want to work with that as well and not shove that under the rug. We're not talking about rainbows and kittens here. We're talking about a realm of reality that can be terrifying and profoundly destructive to social egos and social selves. But I think that's part of the bigger picture. You know, when you study religion, one of the first things you learn is the sacred is not the good. The sacred has this ecstatic, attractive, mysterious quality to it, and it has this negative, destructive, dangerous capacity to it. And both of those are the sacred. In other words, the sacred is the whole thing. And that's the kind of vision that I think we should be after, is that we're after the whole thing, not just a slice of it that makes us feel good or that makes us a better person or a better social actor.
Very valid and important point, I think, and reminds me, I just read sort of Answer to Job by Carl Jung, and the whole idea, sort of the dark side of God, of our collective unconscious.
Yeah, he was great on that. He got into a lot of trouble saying that, by the way.
Yeah.
But it was very honest of him to, his basic argument was the devil is also God. It's the other side of God. And that's a very history of religions kind of thing to say, but it got him into a lot of trouble.
And that was also, I wanted to ask you how you see that, sort of this Jungian thinking, of course, but he makes this plea, which I found sort of also very profound. Never thought of that. I did notice that sort of Christianity is very much a masculine tradition, and it has the male archetype of Yahweh and Christ, of course, and then we have Mother of Christ, Maria, but still not sort of the pure divine. And he mentions Sophia and wisdom sort of as lacking, and that opened my eyes also sort of to the importance of the feminine and the female archetype. I was just wondering what you think there, but.
I'm not, that's a whole nother topic. I'm not a Jungian. I think Jung's notion of the feminine and the masculine were pretty simplistic in terms of contemporary gender theory and queer theory. I guess I'm much more modern or postmodern in that sense. I also, was very much a part of the generation that came up in the 80s. And the question for us was, do religions that feature goddesses, are they more gender equitable? And I think the answer was no. I mean, that's too simple of a statement, but I think the general consensus was gender in the historical religions never works out the way we would want it to with our modern values. I think that's a pretty fair statement. And I think when we want to go back to a particular religious tradition and imagine it as reflecting of our own values in gender and sexuality, we're just deceiving ourselves. I think those values are our values, and they did not exist in the historical past as such. So that's I suppose that's a long way of answering your question.
No, but it also makes me think back of sort of the how I read Jung, that sort of we are the moral creatures. It is us that sort of have to bring sort of the moral.
I could speak all day about Jung. You know, I was in his library in Kusnacht, and I have spoken to many groups of Jungians over the years, and I'm very familiar with. I've read a lot of Carl Jung. My sense of Jung is that he was very well read in the study of religion as it existed in the 30s and 40s. But a lot has happened since then, obviously. It's not that we suddenly know the truth and they didn't, but we think about religion in a different way. And he was very brave about being very interested in the paranormal, for example. But he tended to dismiss states of deification, for example, until he himself had a near-death experience in the 1940s, and he realized these were not just states of ego inflation, as he would call it, before that. So I think there are many Jungs, is what I'm trying to say. And I think we have to be careful when we talk about Carl Jung. Which Jung are we talking about? Are we talking about Jung in the 20s, or are we talking about Jung in the 50s or the 40s? We're talking about Jung and Wolfgang Pauli, the physicist. We're talking about Jung and Freud. What Jung are we talking about here? And so I guess I'm just a little more suspicious of Carl Jung than maybe some other people.
Yeah, I thought it nice to just close down with. It's also a metaphor you used in our previous. In our previous conversation, that of sort of the lava and sort of how the rock cools down, and then we have the tradition. And reading your book, it's as if we have to go in search of the lava, of the volcano stuff, and acknowledge, of course, the rock and the importance of rock, because that we can stand on, right? Just wanted to sort of have this end reflection with you on that metaphor.
Henri Bergson was the one who used the image. And the idea is that, I guess I became obsessed with this metaphor after going to Hawaii and seeing that island is literally exploding. It's literally on fire. I mean, there's like lava coming out of the ground and flowing into the ocean. I'm like, oh my God, this place is like, talk about unstable. But that volcanic activity creates the island, and the island eventually becomes this place of habitation, and eventually human habitation. And you don't get the island without the lava, is where the metaphor goes. And what Bergson was trying to say was, look, there's this elan vital, there's this sort of cosmic evolutionary impulse that's in the religions, that's the lava, and it creates these social movements that then become these civilizations, these islands. And I think he's basically correct about that. And again, this is the superhuman. There is this superhuman lava, but it turns into stone and it turns into islands that we then live on. It turns into the human. But we can't understand the human without understanding that earlier superhuman. And I do think the superhuman comes before the human, by the way. I don't think it's the other way around.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks so much. I think it's a wonderful conversation and more than enough. Great stuff.
I just am very grateful for your reading and for your conversation. Like I said, I can tell instantly whether someone's read a book or not.
Great. Thanks so much.